On Saturday, July 23rd, 1967, Detroit police raided an illegal bar on 12th Street. A crowd watching the raid turned hostile and started to smash store windows. Soon, people began to loot stores and fires spread. Violence escalated through Monday as a full-scale riot broke out. After the fires were put out, many of the buildings were never rebuilt. The riots led to a long period of urban blight and decline in the city. Detroit gained a reputation as a city of crime, violence, and drugs. As the city succumbed to blight, the once burgeoning music scene began to fall apart. Detroit, a city that seemed like it could follow San Francisco as the next big center of pop music, quickly became a barren landscape. But before any of these events, Detroit was a hotbed of many different types of music. The variety of musical influence, culture of the city, and historic events all led to a handful of bands in Detroit who created music that would later be labeled as punk rock, before ultimately falling victim to many of the same issues that plagued the city as a whole. In the words of Willie Dixon, the blues are the roots and the rest are the fruits. In Detroit, John Lee Hooker was the root of the pop music scene. He was the very first musician who put Detroit on the map. In the mid-50s to early 60s, pioneering Detroit rock artists Del Shannon, Bill Haley, Hank Ballard, and Jack Scott all had a few hits to their name. Meanwhile, an independent label called Motown was quickly becoming a major force in the music industry. The Detroit label produced hit soul singles in much the same way that Detroit manufacturers produce cars. As Motown grew, Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels gained national attention for their exciting stage antics and hit singles. Many other local musicians followed suit, but failed to break outside of the state. In 1967, the rock scene exploded in Detroit, with the opening of music venues, mainstream recognition of the counterculture, and more. The same thing was happening simultaneously across the country and over the pond, but the psychedelic rock music that came from Detroit was different. Most citizens of Detroit worked in the auto plants and were consequently tougher than the average hippie, and demanded a place to release their energy built up from toiling on the assembly line. For many, this release came in the form of high-octane rock concerts during the weekend. So, the rock bands of the city developed their own style of driving, high-energy, and hard-rocking music. The city was now filled with many different sounds. The clean-cut soul of Motown, the working man blues of John Lee Hooker, the dirty funk of Parliament Funkadelic, and the hard-edged psychedelic rock of the Amboy Dukes.
The pleasures of the journey to the center of the mind.
At the time, it seemed like Detroit could be the next big music scene. However, unlike San Francisco, the summer of love did not stop in Detroit. Instead of peace and love, Detroit fell into racial violence and rioting. While the music of Detroit was changing, so was the demographic of the city. The big automobile manufacturers, who had supported much of the city's economy, began to move to the suburbs. At the same time, the city began to integrate its citizens. Black families moved into areas that were previously white, while many white families moved away for new jobs or in response to integration efforts. Despite these attempts at integration, black populations were still victims of unequal treatment, especially by the law. Things would come to a head on that fateful day when the 12th Street bar was raided. While arrests were being made, a brick was thrown through the windshield of a police car. This action triggered rioting, looting, and burning that would last for 5 days. The events made it clear that the black population of the city was fed up with this treatment. But this event only gave the police an excuse to continue their brutality against minorities and people who went against their worldview. In the eyes of Wayne Kramer, the guitarist of MC5, the police were the ones that had all the guns, and the people that were killed, that was all police murder. These riots destroyed many buildings and caused many more residents to leave the city. Many of the abandoned buildings were never rebuilt and started an era of decay. The urban blight, when combined with the automobile manufacturers moving out of the city, created a lack of jobs available and a failing economy. These factors led to a greater abundance of hard drugs, alcoholism, violence, crime, a failing education system, and an overall drop in the quality of life. At this point, nobody wanted to invest money into the city, so it continued to decline. This decline led to the death of the music scene in Detroit. Venues closed, artists moved away, and even Motown moved to LA in 1972. But this snowballing effect took a few years to reach a point where the music scene would die. Until the end of the 60s, local bands continued to innovate and hoped to reach national success. One such group was the MC5. MC5, or Motor City 5, formed in 1963 in Lincoln Park, a suburb of Detroit. The band was initially formed by guitarist Wayne Kramer and Fred Smith with other musicians. The lineup was solidified with the addition of Rob Tyner as lead vocalist, Michael Davis on bass guitar, and Dennis Thompson on drums. Rob Tyner and Wayne Kramer had both grown up in Detroit, but their families moved as part of the Great White Flight out of the city. Each member brought their own influences into the musical DNA of the band. Wayne Kramer looked up to his guitar heroes Chuck Berry and the Ventures. Rob Tyner was the beatnik interested in blues, jazz, and poetry. The band also listened to R&B, Motown-style soul, and funk. They began as a garage rock band, playing songs from popular British invasion bands, but they used their varied musical influences to add blues, funk, soul, and jazz elements into their arrangements. Eventually, the band began to write their own material, a rarity for local bands at the time. The jazz connection would completely change the band's trajectory. In the beatnik jazz scene of Detroit, one figure stood out as a leader, John Sinclair. He was a Wayne State student and political activist that formed the Detroit Artists Workshop, a workspace and gathering place for artists of all mediums. In 1966, he was arrested for possession of marijuana and served 6 months in prison. His friends planned a jazz festival to celebrate his release, but another band showed up, the MC5. Hoping to impress John with their jazz-influenced style, they began their set at full blast. But after a complaint from a neighbor who had shown up at the door with a shotgun, Sinclair's wife, Lenny, pulled the plug in the band. Undeterred, the band finally made contact with John through an underground newspaper, the Fifth Estate. Shortly after this interaction, John began to come to MC5 gigs and agreed to manage the group. One of John's first contributions as manager was an agreement to make MC5 the house band of the Grandy Ballroom. The Grandy Ballroom was an old concert hall used by big bands in the 1920s. In the 1960s, it was left vacant. Russ Gibb, a high school teacher and part-time concert promoter, licensed the building. He had visited Bill Graham's Fillmore in San Francisco and wanted to open a venue in the same style back at home. On October 7th, 1966, the Grandy Ballroom officially opened as the first psychedelic ballroom outside of San Francisco. As the venue grew in popularity, Gibb began to book increasingly popular national acts like Cream, Jeff Beck, Janis Joplin, Pink Floyd, The Grateful Dead, and Led Zeppelin. The MC5 opened for many of these bands and more, and were known for outplaying the headliners. Thanks to John Sinclair's deal, the MC5 had become a local sensation. When Sinclair and the MC5 started working together, the band also became members of John Sinclair's Trans Love Energies, a hippie commune on Gratiot Avenue, made up of young, radical musicians and artists. Trans Love Energies eventually morphed into the White Panther Party, an anti-racist group that primarily served as support for the Black Panther Party. MC5 became members of the group, and their shows and image began to reflect the politics of Sinclair, Black Panther Party, and other counterculture ideologies they believed in. But this political revolution was not just for show. One member of the White Panthers, Pun Pomundan, was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list for bombing a local CIA office. The White Panthers practiced shooting in the woods behind their house. Some members of the group truly believed that one day they would be fighting for their lives in a shootout with law enforcement because of their radical plans. Some members of the MC5 did not agree with these actions and resented it from the beginning. Others were wholly committed to the cause. Regardless, the political backdrop the band had become entangled in did give them a unique image of a people's band. The MC5 represented the people in more ways than just the political organization that backed them. The band looked radically different from many of the mainstream groups at the time, which had high beauty standards. They just looked like regular guys from the streets of Detroit that had talent. Eventually, the MC5 adopted flashy stage clothes with colorful fabrics, complex patterns, and shiny sequins. The other way that the band would stand out on stage was their physicality. The MC5 were inspired by James Brown's wild dance moves and would jump around the stage throughout their entire performance. When paired with their already flaming sound, an MC5 show was pure excitement from start to finish.
Hi, my name's Lauren Molinaire, and I'm the guitarist, lead singer in the band The Dogs. We got to open for them at the Crystal Lake Ballroom north of Lansing. That gig was probably the turning point of a live performance in my life. They came out like 5 Pentecostal preachers on stage and related to everybody in the room, in the ballroom, before they even had hit one note. It was the most powerful thing I've ever seen in my life. I have not seen a band since then that did what they did that night to the audience. It was just amazing, and it was very interesting. The audience was like, because it was 69, a lot of hippie kids. There was like truck stop waitress types, hillbilly types there, bikers, and they just related to everybody. And it was the first time, I'd seen girls crying on TV for the Beatles on Ed Sullivan's show, but girls were crying in front of the stage when the MC5 were playing, like they were the Beatles. So it really had an impact on this 15 or 16-year-old I was at that time. And that performance really let me know what a band could do to an audience, and through rock and roll as a vehicle,
Ultimately, though, it was the political image that helped break the band into the mainstream.
Coming up from the state of Ohio will be the nomination of Teddy Kennedy. That nomination is to be made by the former governor of Ohio, Michael V. DeSalle. That could make the state of Ohio, or at least its delegation, or part of it, the biggest thing to happen here in the next week. This is Hugh Daniso, TV5 News, at the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
A major boost in the career of the MC5 occurred in 1968. The MC5 joined a list of musicians who had agreed to play the Vietnam War protest at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. As it turned out, the MC5 were the only band that showed up, but they still wanted to play. They could sense unrest in the crowd and drove off as soon as their set was finished. Just after that, police incited a full-scale riot.
Police charged the crowd. I didn't think I'd get hit because, I'm a medic. Like they said, medic, I'll give you a medic. And then they beat me.
Before they beat me bloody down at the station, they haven't got a word out of me since I got a billion years probation. 69 American terminal stasis, the air's so thick it's like drowning in molasses. I'm sick and tired of paying these dues, and I'm sick to my guts of the American ruse. Phony stars, oh no. Crummy cars, oh no. Cheap guitars, oh no. Joe's primitive
This event helped establish the group's reputation as a band for the people, and the word quickly spread about their gutsy performance. In September 1968, Danny Fields, a talent scout from Elektra Records, attended an MC5 gig after hearing about the Democratic National Convention. Guitarist Wayne Kramer suggested that if he liked their show, he would really love their baby brother band, the Stooges. The Stooges were formed by James Osterberg, former drummer of Ann Arbor bands like the Iguanas and the Prime Movers. After encouragement from Mike Bloomfield of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, he traveled to Chicago to learn from his hero, blues drummer Sammy Lay. He then came back to Detroit with plans to form a blues band with garage rock influences. He recruited brothers Ron and Scott Ashton on guitar and drums respectively, while Dave Alexander took up bass guitar.
So messed up, I want you here. In my room, I want you here. Now we're gonna be face to face, and I'll lay right down in my favorite place. And now I wanna be your dog. And now I wanna be your dog. And now I wanna be your dog.
James became the group's lead singer and frontman under the stage name Iggy Pop. These new members brought more musical ideas into the band, like Buddhist sitar music and Gregorian chants. As the band was starting to rehearse, Iggy saw a Doors concert at the University of Michigan, where Jim Morrison arrived late on stage, stumbled around drunkenly, and finally began singing in a Betty Boop falsetto. Throughout the show, he continued to antagonize the audience. Iggy later said not only was Morrison pissing them off, but he was mesmerizing them at the same time. Iggy was inspired by this performance to start doing whatever he could to get a reaction out of the audience. The band had their first gig on Halloween night in 1967. They soon began playing the Grandy Ballroom regularly the next year. The Grandy was used to workshop the type of music the Stooges would play. At first, their sound was surely unlike anything the audience had heard before. The band was partially inspired by Harry Partch to create their own instruments. Before taking the stage, the Stooges stuck a microphone in a blender full of water and let it run. Iggy eventually strolled on in a maternity dress, a tinfoil wig, and golf shoes, with white makeup covering his face. He shuffled around on a mic'd up waterboard, while Scotty Ashton hit oil drums with hammers, and Ron used a vacuum cleaner. They played other instruments like the theremin, Hawaiian guitar, and a comb that they dropped the microphone into to create a drone. John Sinclair witnessed their first show at the Grandy. He observed that Iggy kind of created this psychedelic drone act as a backdrop for his frontman antics. The other guys were literally his stooges. Iggy would smear his chest with peanut butter and hamburger meat, cut himself with broken glass or razor blades, and climb into the audience and pick fights with audience members. He even claims to have invented stage dives and crowd surfing. Iggy thrived on antagonizing an angry audience, much like Jim Morrison did at the U of M show. Eventually, the band's music drifted away from the soundscapes created by homemade instruments towards simple riffs and distorted feedback effects from the guitars, like Jimi Hendrix had used to great success. The Stooges just picked up their guitars, bass, and drums with little practice and immediately began playing. They showed a spirit with the MC5, but stayed away from the White Panther politics the MC5 were a part of. The Stooges just wanted to make some noise to get a reaction out of the audience, not create social change. When Danny Fields saw the Stooges perform, he knew that he had to sign both the MC5 and the Stooges. He called his boss at Elektra, who told him to offer the MC5 $20,000 and the Stooges $5,000. Both bands agreed on the spot. The MC5 were the first to record for Elektra. It was decided that the album would be captured live in their element at the Grandy on Halloween weekend, 1968. Kick Out the Jams perfectly captured the overwhelming intensity and excitement of their sometimes sloppy live show onto wax. The album began with hype man J.C. Crawford's Fire and Brimstone introduction. Then, the band fired through an R&B tune with a wild falsetto, Ramblin' Rose.
Love is like a rambling road. The more I feel it, the more it grows. Rambling roads, rambling roads.
After that, the title track kept the momentum going. More hard-rocking originals followed, before the rendition of John Lee Hooker's Motor City is Burning. Then, the album reached its climax with its spaced-out, Sun Ra-inspired sounds and Starship. before the band collapsed in a sweaty mess on stage. Although the album showcased the wide variety of the band's repertoire, one song stuck out from the rest and became the band's signature tune. The title track was climbing the charts, and the album was selling well, but Kick Out the Jams quickly became notorious, and the public learned that the album version of the song contained the F word. The controversy was not helped by the liner notes written by John Sinclair. He wrote, "The MC5 is a whole thing. There's no way to get at the music without taking in the whole context of the music too. There is no separation. We say the MC5 is the solution to the problem of separation, because they are so together. The MC5 is totally committed to the revolution, as the revolution is totally committed to driving people out of their separate shells and into each other's arms. We are free men, and we demand a free music, a free high-energy source that will drive us wild into the streets of America, yelling and screaming and tearing down everything that will keep people slaves. The MC5 is that force. The MC5 is the revolution. There is no separation. All power to the people. What you have here in your hands is a living testimonial to the absolute power and strength of these men. Go wild. The world is yours. Take it now and be one with it. Take out the jams."
Well, I feel pretty good, and I guess that I could get crazy now, baby. 'Cause we all got to do no when the dressing room got hazy now, baby. I know how you want it, John, quick and tight. The girls can't stand it when you're doing it right. Let me up on the stand, and let me kick out the jam. Yes, kick out the jam. I have to kick them out.
The Detroit department store chain Hudson's withdrew the album due to the controversy. In response, the band put out an ad in the Fifth Estate underground newspaper. It read, "F. Hudson's," and included an image of the band plus the Elektra logo. Assuming the label had signed off on the ad, Hudson's quickly removed all Elektra albums from their shelves. The label was furious. They immediately withdrew the album and reissued it in censored form. When John Sinclair and Danny Fields argued with the head of the company over these concerns, the band was unceremoniously released from their contract.
Yes, kick out the jams. I done kicked them out.
After the MC5 had already been dropped, Elektra was finally ready to record the Stooges' first album. They traveled to New York to work with producer John Cale, who had recently worked with the Velvet Underground. When it came time to audition the songs they planned to record, John Cale was less than enthusiastic. At the time, the Stooges' live shows consisted of composed songs that lasted 2 to 3 minutes, with extended improvisation on the song's riff for an additional 7 or 8. Cale straight up rejected 3 of the proposed pieces, leaving only 3 songs in their repertoire. "Is that all you have?" he asked. The band claimed they had more material ready, and that he should book them another studio session. Within the next 5 days, the band wrote and arranged 5 more songs to use on the album. These songs contained very simple lyrics and performances, which would go on to influence many future punk acts. Iggy Pop explained that he would watch comedian Soupy Sales on TV as a kid. Soupy would encourage kids to write him a letter, but to keep it 25 words or less. He would use this rule when writing songs for the Stooges, so that the lyrics stayed straight to the point.
No fun, my babe. No fun.
When released, the album was both a commercial and critical disappointment. After being dropped by Elektra, Danny Fields helped the MC5 get signed with Atlantic. Around the same time, John Sinclair was arrested again for possession and sentenced to 9.5 to 10 years in prison. The MC5 decided to sever ties with Sinclair and his White Panther Party and solely focus on their music. With a fresh start, the MC5 set out to record their first proper studio album. Recorded in 1970 with critic-turned-producer John Landau, back in the USA, was the first time the band and the producer recorded an album in the studio. Kick Out the Jams had been criticized for its relatively sloppy playing, so, in the studio, the band did a complete 180 and recorded the album instrument by instrument. The band sacrificed their dynamite, sprawling, experimental, and sometimes heavy live performances for a tight studio sound with short and sweet compositions. It opens and closes with 50s rock covers, Little Richard's Tutti Frutti, and Chuck Berry's Back in the USA.
Bum, 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 tutti frutti.
The album has a similar formula to the style that would later be perfected by punk bands in New York: loud, fast, back-to-basics rock and roll. The sales of the album were lackluster, and the two singles, Tonight and Shakin' Street, did not chart. Some of the commercial failure can be blamed on Atlantic, who did not have a promotions office in the US and was therefore limited in their exposure they could give to the band. They did, however, have one overseas, and the MC5 soon embarked on their first European tour. The band found that audiences in Europe enjoyed the style of songs on Back in the USA much more than they did the ones on their debut. The album would leave an impact on future punks in Europe. After the release of the Stooges' debut, Iggy invited saxophonist Steve McKay to join the band. They then traveled west for the first time to record their second album in LA. The band recorded together live in the studio, while Iggy danced around with a handheld mic. This recording method perfectly captured the band's live set in a studio environment. Most of the songs were built around a repeating groove, as Iggy's wild vocal style and Ron Ashton's searing guitar solos took center stage. Funhouse again failed to make much of an impact. At the time of Funhouse's release, the Detroit rock scene was nearing its end. The overall counterculture that the bands were a part of was beginning to fall apart, as people realized the dreams of radical social change were not as practical as they had believed. The Vietnam War dragged on, and marijuana remained illegal. The dark side of the culture was being put into the spotlight. When a fan was murdered at the Altamont Free concert, the Rolling Stones answered to Woodstock, and Charles Manson's crimes began to be uncovered. The 60s ended, as kids grew up and became part of the system that they were previously rebelling against. Meanwhile, the rock concert was becoming increasingly commercialized. Small venues like the Grandy Ballroom closed, and arena tours became the preferred venues to experience live music. Instead of local groups, opening acts were booked as package deals with the headliners from the same booking agency. In Michigan, the drinking age was lowered to 18, and bars became the place for small acts to begin playing. This was detrimental to the state's music scenes, because playing to a group of drunk adults was completely different to a room of dancing kids. At this time in Detroit, the city's downfall was still escalating. Unemployment was high, and citizens began to rely more and more on hard drugs, drinking, and crime. When all of these factors combined, it's no wonder why the scene was on the brink of destruction. When it came time for Elektra to decide whether or not to renew their contract with the Stooges, the label passed on the opportunity. Around this time, the entire band, apart from Ron Ashton, fell headfirst into heroin addiction. Without label support, the group continued to decay until they called it quits in 1971. This original incarnation of the Stooges left behind 2 studio albums and unforgettable memories for the audiences they played in front of. While the MC5 were on their tour of Europe, the band was asked to record their third album, High Time. This final effort showcased Fred Smith's songwriting capabilities. The band finally sounded comfortable and confident within the studio. The recording finally captured the lumbering beast that was the MC5 in the studio environment. Despite High Time's strengths, there wasn't a cut that had hit potential, and no single was released. Predictably, the album again failed to make a commercial impact, and Atlantic decided to drop the band. The group continued to soldier on, playing gigs without support of a label. First, Michael Davis left the band in 1972. Then, Dennis Thompson and Rob Tyner refused to go on tour. For a short time, Wayne Kramer and Fred Smith continued playing as the MC5.
We wanted to play the Grandy Ballroom, and it was already declining by 1972. We had came down from Lansing to do an audition on a Saturday morning. We get there, and the promoter, he says, I'll tell you what, if you let the MC5 use your gear, you can play right before him and share the dressing room. Well, it was my 21st birthday that night. And so there we got to share the dressing room with our heroes, who at that point had came back limping into Detroit after going to England. They didn't even have Michael Davis on bass at that point. He was in federal penitentiary on drug charges. They had no gear, but Wayne Kramer got to use one of my Marshalls, Fred Smith the other, and we got to share the dressing room with those guys. And Rob Tyner came up to Mary Kay, my bass player, and myself, and said, when your train comes into the station, you better jump aboard because it doesn't wait. And we looked at each other and went, why is he telling us this? They knew that they had blown it probably, and he was kind of telling us something that we didn't even know why he told us that. And we didn't really know what that meant until after the fact ourselves. But they went out and they kicked ass. You know, some people might say, oh, they weren't at their high point, but they were still the freaking MC5. That was the next to the last gig that they ever played, because that was November 10th.
On December 12, 1972, the band was convinced to play together one last time as a farewell at the Grandy Ballroom. The venue that the band used to fill to capacity contained only a few dozen people. After a few songs, Kramer became fed up with the lackluster performance and left to cop dope. The band finished the gig without him, and the mighty MC5 reached its unceremonious end. After the breakup of both the MC5 and the Stooges, various members began solo careers or joined new bands. The Stooges reformed in London as Iggy and the Stooges to record the album Raw Power before Iggy began his successful solo career. Some other groups that stemmed from these two bands included Ascension, The New Order, Sonic's Rendezvous Band, and the Rob Tyner Band. However, none of these projects matched the experimental nature of the original groups. Starting in the 2000s, both bands took part in a handful of reunions, including the studio albums The Weirdness from the Stooges in 2007 and the MC5's Heavy Lifting in 2024. As of 2025, Iggy Pop is the only surviving member of the two great proto-punk bands. However, despite the collapse of Detroit's music, Michigan musicians soldiered on. Those who broke into the mainstream focused on touring nationally, rather than playing the local club circuit like those who came before them. Grand Funk Railroad and Alice Cooper achieved the level of success the Stooges and MC5 were looking for. But some groups stuck it out in the city, building on the formula their predecessors had created. The Up came from Ann Arbor and were closely associated with the MC5 and the Stooges. In fact, the Up were managed by the MC5's John Sinclair and became the White Panther Party's main vehicle of musical revolution after the MC5 left the party. The band's history was one of many missed opportunities. The Up played the same gig that convinced Danny Fields to sign the MC5 and Stooges, but they received no such recording contract. They almost played at the Democratic National Convention, but the MC5 told them to turn around just as the riots were beginning to start. In 1970, the band self-released the single Just Like an Aborigine.
Just like an Aborigine, just like an Aborigine.
Which did next to nothing for the band. Perhaps their moment of greatest exposure was at the John Sinclair Freedom Rally, a benefit concert that successfully helped release Sinclair from his 10-year prison sentence. Along with the Up, the bill featured major acts like Stevie Wonder, Bob Seger, and John Lennon, in one of his less than 24 performances as a solo artist. The Up even recorded a single, Free John Now, which was given out for free to attendees. The group soldiered on until 1973, when they splintered apart without finding a record deal. Upon watching the Beatles perform on The Ed Sullivan Show, three Detroit brothers decided to form the band. Bobby Hackney picked up the bass, David Hackney the guitar, and Dennis Hackney the drums. They first called themselves the Rock Funk Fire Express in 1971 and played a mix of funk and pop rock that they heard on Detroit's KCLW. Then, after seeing The Who perform at the Grandy Ballroom, they switched directions to a hard rock sound. They started playing along to albums in their collection by bands like Alice Cooper, MC5, The Who, and Queen before they began to write their own music. In 1973, David convinced his brothers to change the name of the band to Death. Just prior to this, their father had been killed by a drunk driver. His concept was spinning death from the negative to the positive, his brother Bobby Hackney later said. The band recorded demos at Detroit's Grooveville Productions. The studio began sending the band's music around the world to various record labels, but nobody seemed interested. Finally, Clive Davis, the owner of Columbia Records, said that he was interested in the group if they would agree to change their name. David said no, and that was that. The band decided to take their master tapes they recorded and press 500 copies of the song Politicians in My Eyes for radio airplay.
Always trying to be slick when they tell us that they're responsible for sending young men to die. We have waited so long for someone to come along and correct our country wrong, but the wait's been too long.
Unfortunately, this bit of promotion was not enough. The band eventually had to sell their instruments to get by. Frustrated by their misfortunes, they decided to take a vacation to stay with family in Burlington, Vermont. With nothing to lose, they found apartments and decided to stay. Finally, the group decided to drop the name Death and recorded a religious album under the name Fourth Movement. This too did not sell. At this point, the band decided to call it quits. David moved back to Detroit, and Bob and Dennis formed a reggae group called Lamb's Bread. Fast forward to 2008, and Politicians in My Eyes had become a cult classic. It had been featured on punk compilations like Killed by Death, and was known as a collector's item by vinyl record enthusiasts. Julian Hackney heard the song online and recognized his father Bobby's voice. His band, Rough Francis, began to play Death songs. Eventually, Julian was able to get his family's music released under the name For All the World to See in 2009 to honor David, who had passed away in 2000. Death reformed to play shows to support its release, and has since recorded 2 new studio albums. Death and Rough Francis continue to play their family's music for all the world to see. The Punks were from Waterford, Michigan, and were another early example of punk rock in the style of the MC5 and Stooges. They were formed in 1973. In 1977, they changed their name to The End and tried to make it in the New York punk scene, but it was not to be. They broke up, but continued to play together in private. Their recordings were issued in the 2000s. They reunited for one show at the Motor City Music Awards in 2015, and their song My Time's Comin' was used in the TV show Vinyl.
My time's coming, oh. You keep gunning today. I put to my own fate. Well, what can I say? I don't care the way. My time's coming.
In 1968, Lansing guitarist Lauren Molinaire, bassist Mary Kay, and drummer Ron Wood decided to form a band. They named themselves after the Stooges' first single, I Wanna Be Your Dog. The Dogs knew their name was going to work when Lauren's mom was repulsed upon hearing it. There were a few local cover bands in Lansing, but the main scene was rooted in Detroit. So, the Dogs decided to move to the city. They played gigs around Michigan and opened for acts like MC5 and Bob Seger.
It was 1974, and we were living in Detroit. We had went down to Toledo Sports Arena to play with Bob Seger. It was Bob Seger headlining. We were next to headline, and there was a couple Toledo bands on it at the Toledo Sports Arena. We had been there all day, and we were set up on stage in the hockey arena there. And Bob's road manager came into the dressing room, said, "Hey, look, Bob's tired. He wants to go on early. You guys close the show." And this is Bob Seger. He's the headliner. We were already set up. We go, "We're not going to do that. We're already set up. We're at least going to go out and play one song, and then Bob can come out." And the road manager and the promoter said, "F you, if you do that, you're going to jail." And we said, "Really? We'll rock and fucking roll." And we went on stage, and Toledo City cops came on stage with billy clubs and arrested 2 or 3 of our roadies. Mary, the bass player, the drummer. I did not get arrested. They got charged with felony charges, inciting to riot. The agency, the booking agency that booked Bob Seger, MC5, and Boy Dukes, all the Detroit bands, ended up saying to all the promoters, if the Dogs are on the bill, if you want the Dogs to play, then you're not going to get our bands being the best bands in the world. So we got blackballed basically for standing up for rock and roll, and we couldn't get a gig, we couldn't play the good shows. So we said, screw this, we're going to move to New York.
So, in 1974, they moved out to New York, where they found themselves in a very different style of proto-punk scene, with bands like Television, The Dictators, and The Stilettos, who would later become Blondie. Although these groups did not play the same style of energetic music as the Dogs, they had a similar mentality of redefining what rock music is. Ultimately, the band was not making enough money to stay in New York. They relocated to LA in 1976, where they recorded 2 singles, John Rock and Slash Your Face. The Dogs continued to reside in LA and perform their music. They recently had a homecoming concert in Michigan, where they are finally signed to a label, 57 years later. Their new single will be released later this year. Lauren says that he feels a connection with the bluesmen like John Lee Hooker in the 60s. The Dogs will continue to play until their dying day and keep the spirit of Detroit rock and roll alive in the 21st century. Each of these groups contain multiple elements that would influence punk rock. The snotty vocal delivery of the Stooges and the Punks, the anarchic politics of the MC5 and the Up, the breaking of racial and gender barriers by Death and the Dogs. And that's without mentioning the wild, high-octane concerts they all put on. Detroit truly contained a rock scene that broke boundaries but was ignored by the rest of the country. These bands were ahead of their time, and it would take until 1977 for New York to catch up and officially kick off the greater punk movement. Thankfully, these groups' music are easily accessible and will hopefully get their time in the spotlight. The living members of these bands deserve their flowers while they are still with us, and we can only hope that the youth of today will continue to take music to new places.
Thank you, and good night!